What's up, Green Bay Packers fans? Welcome back, and as always, thank you for joining me. My name is Paul Brettel. Today, we're going to discuss the upcoming offseason, specifically why I think the offensive line is going to be another big need for the Green Bay Packers, something that we see Brian Gutekunst address fairly heavily this upcoming offseason. The recipe is there for all that to happen, but first, you know what to do. Hit like on the video, hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. I do greatly appreciate it. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brettel. Find all my work, including the article version of what we're discussing here today, over at ESPNLacrosse.com. And my Wisconsin sports radio fans, download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. Packers, Brewers, Bucks, Badgers, everything you need to get you through the week. So, like I said, we're going to talk about the Green Bay Packers offensive line and why I think addressing it somewhat heavily is very much in play for Green Bay this upcoming offseason, even though it's not, at least that I've seen a lot of, conversation as one of the bigger positions in need for this team. So as we all know, Brian Gutekunst builds through the trenches. He said it in a season-ending press conference that that's one of the, core fundamental beliefs the organization has when it comes to building a good football team. And we've seen him walk the walk with that. That isn't just, GM speak, so to speak, where we see the Packers and Gutekunst do that on a regular basis. In 3 of their last 4 draft classes, they've drafted at least 3 offensive linemen. Again, in 3 of the last 4 years. That's an infusion of 9 offensive linemen onto this roster in a relatively short amount of time. And again, that doesn't include players who are already on the roster, some low-level free agent signings like an Andre Dillard. So they prioritize it. So going down this path and us having this conversation here today about this isn't going to be anything new for the Green Bay Packers. In fact, like we just talked about, recent history suggests that it's very much in play. As Brian Gutekunst said, the big guys are hard to find, and it's a core fundamental aspect that the Packers have when it comes to building a good football team. And it's not just the Packers. The old saying goes, if you control the line of scrimmage, you control the game. Just look at the Philadelphia Eagles, one of the best offensive lines in football, one of the best defensive lines in football, and they're playing in the Super Bowl. So that is something that the Packers have routinely done. And again, I think it's very much in play this offseason. Now, looking back at the play of the 2024 offensive line, I think the continuity that group had was really, really important to their success, particularly in pass protection. According to ESPN, the Packers' starting 5 on the offensive line played 830 snaps together during the 2024 season. No other offensive line in football had more snaps together. And I think where we really saw that continuity in play was in pass protection. When it comes to the offensive line, the sum of the parts are very much greater than the individual. You can have an amazing all-pro caliber right tackle, but if the left side of your offensive line is below average, you're overall not going to have the greatest offensive line unit because defenses are going to target that side of the offensive line, even though you have a right tackle who may be one of the best in football. It's the sum of the parts, and you maximize that quality, again, when you have that continuity, when there's a familiarity and understanding of obviously the role that each specific player has, but also just knowing where the offensive linemen next to you are going to be and having that trust that your teammates are going to be in certain spots, particularly when you're dealing with blitzers, when you're dealing with stunts up front and passing that off. And again, Sean Ryan knowing that Zach Tom's going to be there at the right tackle spot. And during the season, this past season, I asked Sean Ryan about that because, again, it's so effortless just how they pass defenders off from one to the other, and asked him, how do you do that? Is that just, is there communication? Is there what takes place as this play's unfolding for you guys to do that so effortlessly? And he didn't really have a specific answer, right? It's just the trust and knowing that your teammate is going to be there. And that's built through reps. That's built through experience. That's built through games. That's built through experiencing those things together. So that continuity component was, I think, really, really an important factor to the success that the Packers had, specifically in pass protection last season. Creates a cohesiveness where the unit, all 5 players, are operating as one. And again, in the numbers, it bears it out as well. Love was actually the most blitz quarterback during the regular season last year, according to Pro Football Focus. But in terms of pressure rate on him, he ranked 23rd in pressure rate. The offensive line did a really good job of giving him consistently the time he needed in the pocket. By ESPN's pass block win rate metric, The Packers ranked 7th in the NFL, their offensive line unit did. So, again, in Gutekunst's season-ending press conference talking about the offensive line, he specifically mentioned how he liked how that unit held up in pass protection. Now, when it comes to the run blocking that we saw from the Packers offensive line this past season, again, Josh Jacobs rushed for over 1,300 yards, right? There were a number of games where the Packers leaned heavily on the run game to help guide them to victory. It was a sound year in that regard. However, as Gutekunst is going through talking about the offensive line, I think it's noteworthy that, again, he mentioned their play and pass protection, but didn't necessarily bring up the run blocking component to it. And like I said, it was still a very solid year. Josh Jacobs rushed for 1,329 yards, 6th most among all running backs in football. There were a ton of just positive gains. He averaged 4.4 yards for a rush, and I can't tell you how many times he looked like there was nowhere for him to go, but he turned it into something, even if it was just a 3-4 yard gain. There are a lot of positives. The Packers were able to lean on that element. The offensive line this year seemed to take on a much more physical mentality, right? Embracing that run-heavy role that the offense started to undertake, especially as the second half of the season went on. But if there was something that was lacking in the run game, it was the really big runs. Like I said, Josh Jacobs was really good at generating 4, 5, 6 yards per rush. And you can lean on that over the course of the game, as the Packers did on a number of occasions, to help lead you to victory. But there weren't those 20-yard runs, those 15-yard runs, those 30-yard runs, right? We did not see a lot of those. Now, in terms of quantity of those rushes, Josh Jacobs finished 11th in rushes of 15 or more yards. Not bad. But I think a lot of that's a product of just the number of touches he got, right? One of the best backs in football. You give him enough carries, he's obviously going to rip off some big runs, which he did. Again, 11th most rushes of 15 or more yards. But I think what's more of an accurate portrayal in terms of those big runs is his efficiency with them. Pro Football Focus, in that regard, Josh Jacobs ranked 32nd in breakaway percentage, which is, again, how often, based on how many carries you have, how many of those carries are turning into runs of 15 or more yards. He ranked 32nd in that regard. So, again, the quantity element of it, just overall numbers, again, he touches the ball a lot. He's a really good running back. Those are going to be a product, right? But from an efficiency standpoint, how often are you generating those runs? Josh Jacobs was 32nd in that regard. And again, that's, to me, that's more about the offensive line, because as we just referenced a minute ago, and I'm sure many can picture this, how many times did Josh Jacobs have the ball and he's at the line of scrimmage and you think, oh, there's nothing there. And then all of a sudden he turns it into a 3, 4, maybe 5 yard gain because he's got such quick feet and has just a sixth sense for where the openings are, how to make defenders miss. And I think an accurate portrayal of that is, again, these are numbers are from Pro Football Focus. Of Jacobs' 1,329 rushing yards, 1,039 of them came after contact. That's 78% of his yards came after contact. There are only 2 other running backs in football who had more yards after contact than Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley. Those two, however, Saquon Barkley eclipsed the 2,000-yard rushing mark. Derrick Henry was just shy of it. In terms of percentage of yards coming after contact, they were in the 50-55% range. Jacobs was at 78%. So again, it's tough to generate steadily those really big plays, right? Those 15, 20-yard runs when you're being contacted at the line of scrimmage often. You need to be able to get to the second level in space in order to have those opportunities to generate those big plays, which Josh Jacobs obviously has the ability to do if given the opportunity. So I think that's an area where this Packers team going into 2025, offensive line-wise, run game-wise, has to improve. How do we generate more big plays? I think that's going to be something that they're going to have to identify. And one potential element to it, the Packers very much this season, with Josh Jacobs as the running back, shifted to a much more gap scheme heavy running game, running between the tackles. So it suits Josh Jacobs best. That's when he's at his best. Previously, Packers ran a lot of their heavy outside zone, getting the offensive lineman on the move, getting the ball carrier outside the tackle. So this change to this running scheme, it was different. It was different for the offensive line. It was different for the offense as a whole. So I'm curious to see as we go into year two, is there, again, we go back to continuity, right? Is there is that an element? Is there a familiarity component now that you've had a full season where you've utilized that blocking scheme more heavily, where there's added comfort, there's added effectiveness to it? Or do we see Matt LaFleur maybe swing the pendulum back in the other direction a little bit and have Josh Jacobs operate more in that outside zone running scheme, which of course is a staple in Matt LaFleur offense and what the offensive line had been asked to do previously. But as we look at where this offensive line can improve, I think that element specifically, how do we generate more big plays? And again, that starts with helping Josh Jacobs, Marshawn Lloyd, the Packers running backs, get to the second level more often, where then they're in space and they can make defenders miss. So to put a bow on all this, why is the recipe there for the Packers to, again, somewhat heavily address the offensive line? One, we talked about it at the start. Gutekunst's track record. 3 of the last 4 drafts, he's drafted at least 3 offensive linemen in 3 of the last 4 years. The history's there. It's how he operates. It's what this Packers team does from a roster construction standpoint. The second ingredient to all of this is, I think, adding depth and competition to the offensive line. Gutekunst said during his season in press conference that you don't want to overreact to one game, specifically the Eagles game in the playoffs is what he was referencing, because the offensive line really, really struggled against the Eagles' 4-man rush. It becomes really difficult to move the ball when the 4-man rush can get home and they can still drop 7 into coverage. It becomes really, really difficult. And of course, a product of that is they lost Elton Jenkins to injury early in that game. And they also didn't have Jordan Morgan, who was on injured reserve. So I don't know, looking around the NFL, how many offensive lines are equipped well enough to be able to have their 7th guy step into that game and up against that defensive line specifically and still find success. Like that was a really, really difficult ask of Travis Glover in his first significant NFL snaps, Kadeem Telford as well, right? So again, that's why you don't want to necessarily overreact to it, because you're relying on, again, your 7th offensive lineman on the depth chart to come in mid-game against one of the best defensive fronts in football, right? It's a tall ask. But having said that, depth or competition has been, and Gutekunst has talked about this for 2 years now, that's been one of the key catalysts to the overall growth and success that this Packers team has had so quickly as they went younger and transitioned to Jordan Love being the quarterback. So I think we see the Packers stick with that theme, right? You hope internally Travis Glover, Kadeem Telford, they take strides in their second and third NFL seasons, that they become more dependable. So if you do have to rely on them off the bench, they can fill in and provide a steady presence for you. That's the hope. Do you bank on that happening? Not at all. That's why you need to go out in the draft and, again, bring in more talent to compete with them, to push them, which hopefully leads to growth. But if not, if they aren't good enough, you have some other options available to you on the roster. So I think that's the second component to this, improving the depth of this Packers offensive line. Lastly, third part of the recipe for why the Packers are going to dive into the offensive line this offseason, I think specifically in the draft, as they do, is the draft's about planning ahead, right? I know on the outside, everyone gets fixated on what's the immediate need, who can step in and make an impact right away. And as the NFL's transitioned over the years, like that's become a bigger part of it. The draft and develop in terms of sitting on the bench is becoming less and less, right? You want guys who can make an impact right away. But the draft is also about looking down the road, right? Having a 2, 3, 5-year vision for where your organization's going, where your roster's going, and building it now with that in mind. And as we look just 12 months down the road, potentially a lot of changes coming to the Packers offensive line. I mean, this offseason alone, Josh Myers is set to hit free agency. A couple of videos ago, we talked about what I think is going to happen in that regard. We look a year from now, next offseason, 2026, Sean Ryan, Zach Tom, Rasheed Walker, all free agents next offseason. I think the only thing from that trio that we can say is Zach Tom's going to be back. Whether it's an extension this offseason, whether they reach an extension during the season, whether it goes into next offseason, Zach Tom is going to be on this Green Bay Packers team long term. We can't say that confidently about Sean Ryan. We can't say that confidently about Rasheed Walker. We can't say that confidently this offseason about Josh Myers. And when it comes to replacing Josh Myers, let's say he does head elsewhere in free agency, I think the Packers already have some options on the roster to fill that role. Jacob Monk, who they drafted last year, played center at Duke. I think Sean Ryan's an option as well. During training camp this past summer, they gave him quite a few reps at the center position. And also, if you move Ryan to center, that then allows you to get Jordan Morgan in the mix, right? He can take over at right guard. You have Elton at left guard. Sean Ryan's your center. You have Rasheed Walker, Zach Tom as your tackles. If I were to make an early prediction for the Packers Week 1 starting offensive line, that's my guess. But if you're having Sean Ryan move over, you have Jordan Morgan, who was depth this year off the bench, come into a starting slot, well, now you need to replace that depth, right? And we go back to the previous conversation. So just because there may be answers already on the roster to fill who's going to take over for Josh Myers if he ends up playing elsewhere, well, then who's going to take over for the spot on the bench, right? Who's going to bolster the depth? So again, these are kind of the three big reasons why I think the Packers are going to end up investing into the offensive line this offseason. Lastly, before we get out of here, as the upcoming months unfold, the pre-draft process takes place, remember versatility. It's what the Packers absolutely love along the offensive line. Look for offensive linemen who have played both guard and tackle at the college level. Look for players who have played all three of the interior offensive line positions. Look for day three offensive tackles who have the ability to move inside, right? That's the hallmark. That's what the Packers believe in when it comes to building their offensive line. So as you're trying to identify players who might be on the Packers' radar, keep that first and foremost. Versatility, versatility, versatility. So, as always, my friends, I appreciate you tuning in. You know what to do. Hit like on the video. Hit subscribe on the YouTube channel. Follow me on Twitter at Paul_Brett. I'll find all my work over at ESPNLacrosse.com and download the 105.5 ESPN Lacrosse app. Till next time, friends, take care.